Think not of it, dear. See how that last bit of sunshine comes full upon your face as you talk about it. That is your sign, my dear, that you have your wish." It was the last bit of sunshine, for the next moment the golden disk was hid behind a ridge of hills. Yet they walked on for nearly a mile further, and, when they returned to the King's Head, they found the good man of the house already returned, and his supper, as his wife assured them, very nearly finished. "He shall come to you in half a minute, ladies, if you'll please be seated, while I bring in the candles. I have told him all you said to me, and he don't seem so much put out by much, as me, but he's uncommon cute, as you'll find when you comes to talk to him." In about a quarter of an hour, Mr. Prescott knocked at the parlor door, and being properly introduced to the ladies by his wife, was left standing before them while she retreated to pursue her various avocations. "Your wife has told you, Mr. Prescott, our reasons for coming here?" said Miss Brotherton, glad to escape the repetition of her fictitious tale. "She has, ma'am," was the succinct reply. "And do you think it possible for us to obtain admission to Deep Valley Mill, and to go over it in such a manner as to give us an opportunity of seeing all the children?" "If I had heard that much as to your purpose, ladies, and nothing more, I should have said no. You couldn't have no more get into Deep Valley Factory than into the moon. But my missus added something to the back of it that as makes a difference." This was said with a look and accent which fully justified Mrs. Prescott's assurances of her good man's cuteness. "I think, Mr. Prescott, that she said no more than I am willing to make good," replied Mary. "I do not wish to expend money wantonly, but, if less will not serve, I am ready to give £500 to any person who could enable me to see all the children in Deep Valley." "It is a long sum, miss," replied the man thoughtfully, "and I can't but fancy that less might serve. The people as is in authority there is bad people. I don't scruple to say it, and sooner than open their doors for pity towards any Christian soul, man, woman, or child, they would see 'em all in the bottomless pit. But 'tis just because they do all the wickedness we hears of, that I sees hope they mays be bought to break their own laws. For if they does one thing for the love of gold, they may do another. 'Tis plain enough to see, to be sure, that theys knows it is for their interest to keep all eyes off their cruel goings-ons, and what's for their interest they won't easily give up. So it may be that Squire Elgin Sharpton himself would turn away from £500 rather than show off his poor miserable apprentices, but that mayn't hold good for his agent, and I believe in my heart that, if we could quietly get to offer Woodcombe, the manager, £100, you would not have long to wait for a sight of the children." "And how is this to be done, Mr. Prescott?" said Miss Brotherton. "If you can undertake to manage it, you may put what price you like on your services. I feel certain that you would not name a higher sum than I should be willing to pay." "Why, as for me, miss, I must not be known to meddle or make in the matter. Squire Sharpton would have my license away before I could say Jack Robinson. Any advice I can give is at your service, and I may be able to put you up, perhaps, to doing the thing that is the likeliest way. But as to my going to the mill, it won't do. One reason is that I never was there before, and it's likely enough that, seeing a stranger, they'd set the dogs at me before I had time to say my errand. No, that won't answer. The only man I can think of as would give us a chance is one Smith, the miller, as serves them with oatmeal, and pretty stuff 'tis, as I've been told, which I don't speak over well for his honesty, you'll say, though 'tis likely the price is in proportion. Howsoever, whether he be good or bad, I don't know another as comes and goes to Deep Valley as he does, and that's what makes me fix upon him as a messenger." "And when could I see this man?" demanded Mary. "Why, betimes to-morrow, miss, there's no doubt, if I goes and gives him notice." "Then do so, Mr. Prescott, and be assured your trouble shall not be forgotten." "There's no fear of it, miss," replied the acute landlord with very honest sincerity, "and I'll go to the mill outright. But I think you'll be pleased to excuse me for speaking my mind, that you two ladies must settle between yourselves what you'd be willing to give Timothy Smith himself for the job, seeing that he's not one to work for nothing. And another thing I'll make so free as to mention is, that you do well to make 'em understand that you don't want to get inside their wicked den, but only to see the children, one and all of 'em, and then, you know, miss, they may trim 'em and scour 'em up a little for shame's sake afore they brings 'em out." Miss Brotherton, after this conversation, felt as fully convinced as a good wife as the good wife herself could desire of the value of the landlord's head, and determined to be guided by his advice. After a little further conversation between them, it was settled that she should write a note to Mr. Woodcombe, the manager, in readiness to give into their hands of Mr. Timothy Smith on the following morning, if she could prevail upon him to deliver it. Mr. Prescott performed his part of the business ably, for the portly miller was waiting for the ladies in the parlour when they returned from their early walk. Miss Brotherton possessed a sort of instinctive skill in reading the human countenance, which rarely deceived her, and it took her not long to discover that the man she had now to deal with was one upon whom it would be folly to waste any arguments which did not affect his own interest. She, therefore, briefly stated the fact that it was of great importance to her to obtain sight of all the apprentices at Deep Valley Mill, having a great reason to hope that she should find a young relative there, for whose release from all engagements she was willing to pay handsomely. "It is not the custom, ma'am, to admit visitors to that factory. It had been found to hinder the work," replied the miller solemnly. "So I understand, sir. But hearing that you are in the habit of visiting the mill on business, I have taken the liberty to send for you in order to say that if you would undertake to deliver this note to Mr. Woodcombe, the manager, I would willingly give you £5 for your trouble." "That is hardly enough, ma'am, for the risk of offending so good a customer," replied the miller. "Will double the sum induce you to do it for me?" said Mary. "On what day do you wish it to be reached Mr. Woodcombe's hand?" demanded Mr. Timothy Smith, endeavouring to retain a doubtful expression of countenance. "Today, sir, as early as possible." "Then, ma'am, I'll be fair and open with you, and not go about to mince the matter or deceive you in any way. If you will pay me down £20 in gold or Bank of England notes, I will consent to give up all the important business I had fixed to do this morning, and undertake not only to give your letter to Mr. Woodcombe, but to use my influence with him, which is greater than you may guess for, to make him do what you wish, provided that you treat him with the liberality which a gentleman like him has a right to expect." Miss Brotherton drew forth her pocket-book. "I will give you the £20 you demand, Mr. Smith," she said, in a tone as business-like and as decided as his own. "If you perform my errand successfully, I will give you this £10 note now. If you perform my errand successfully, I will give you this £10 note now, as payment for conveying the letter, and another of the same value when you return to me with the manager's permission to see the children who are apprenticed at the mill." Mr. Timothy Smith looked at Miss Brotherton's pocket-book, and he looked at her. His glance at the first inspired a strong inclination to increase his demands, but the miller had studied the human countenance as well as the lady, and when he looked upon her, he felt certain that, though young, rich, and very eager in the pursuit of her object, she was not a fool, and that if he pushed her to a more preposterous payment than he had already proposed, she would be likely to turn about and look for another agent. He therefore demurely replied, "It is all fair, ma'am. I agree to the terms." And, without wasting any further time, the man of the mill received the note, put on his hat, and departed. Not all Mary's self-command, and considering all things, yet a great deal, could enable her to await the return of her costly messenger with composure. All that she heard of this mysterious mill tended to prove that it was precisely such a place as Sir Matthew Dowling would be likely to fix upon as the abode of Mchl. The more she meditated, the more she became convinced that the boy was there, and she was hot and cold, pale and red, a dozen times in an hour. She had kept a copy of her letter to the manager, that she might show it to Mr. Bell, for whom she hoped to receive absolution for the innocent fraud she had practised. To read and reread this letter, and to speculate with Miss Tremlett upon its probable and possible effects, occupied some portion of the tedious time, slowly dragging her steps up and down Mrs. Prescott's little garden, and occasionally sitting for a fidgety 5 minutes in a bower of scarlet runners, employed the rest. But the morning seemed endless, and more than once she suspected that her watch stood still. The important letter to Mr. Woodcombe was as follows: "Sir, a wealthy and respectable family, having recently reason to believe that a dear child, long considered as lost, has been sent as an apprentice to Mr. Elgood Sharpton's factory at Deep Mill. Fully aware that the examination necessary to prove whether this hope be well founded must be attended with considerable trouble to you, inasmuch as children must be brought out from their work to see me. I beg to say that, if, without giving me further trouble, you will permit this, I will pay the sum of £100 for the accommodation. Should it be refused, I must have recourse to other means for the purpose of ascertaining what is so important for me to know. I am, sir, your obedient servant, Dorcas Tremlett. It was not 5 o'clock in the afternoon, by which time Mary was fully persuaded that her commission had failed, that Mr. Timothy Smith, in his white hat and well-powdered blue coat, was again seen approaching the King's Head. The heiress, who was sitting near the window, started up, and would certainly have stepped forward to meet him, had not Miss Tremlett whispered, "Sit down, Miss Mary, sit down. There's a darling, and look like a great lady as you did this morning, and that's what you are, and always should be." Mary reseated herself, and, after a short interval, the miller knocked at the parlour door, and was desired to enter. Miss Brotherton pointed at a chair, and he rested himself. "The weather is warm, ladies," said he, drawing forth a cotton handkerchief, and wiping his head and face, "and I have not loitered in my errand, as you may see by the state I'm in. But my horse is getting in years, like his master, and it's no easy work to drive him by such a road as I have come to by." "Have you succeeded, sir?" said Miss Brotherton, looking as grand as Miss Tremlett could desire. "I am happy to say, ma'am," he replied with dignity, "that the second £10 is fairly won." "I rejoice to hear it," cried Mary, brightly colouring, "and I shall have great pleasure in paying it. When, sir, may I see these children?" she added, pulling out her pocket-book as she spoke. "Here, ma'am, is Mr. Woodcomb's reply to your note, and on the reading of that I look to hear you say that the £10 is mine." Miss Brotherton took the dirty epistle offered her, and read: "Ma'am, my employer is strict in his orders not to let the hands be interrupted, as they are too often in some mills, to gratify the idle curiosity of strangers. But in consideration of your handsome proposal, and hoping that you won't scruple to follow it with a like sum in the case of your finding and carrying away the child, which will be no more than just, seeing that if I part with a hand I must get another in the place of it, on this condition I am willing that all the children out of the premises shall be placed in the feeding room for your inspection at 12 o'clock tomorrow. I am, ma'am, your humble servant, James Woodcomb." The miller kept his eyes fixed upon her as she read, and the result he looked for followed the perusal of the dispatch he had brought. Miss Brotherton handed the letter to her friend, and then drew the promised banknote from her pocket-book. The jolly miller rose, and received it from her hands. "I thank you, madam," said he, folding it carefully, "and I beg to say, in return, that you would have been troubled to find another man who could have done your errand so well." "I am quite satisfied, sir," she replied, "and will only ask in addition to what you have already done for me, that you will be obliging enough to tell me by what conveyance it would be best for us to get to the factory tomorrow. Mr. Woodcomb, as you know, has named 12 o'clock. I suppose the distance is too great for us to walk?" "Quite impossible, ma'am, altogether out of the question, but I shall have no objection to hire out my chay-cart for the day, and if so be you would think it suitable," said the obliging miller. "I have no doubt it would do perfectly well, provided you have a horse that can draw it. I should be sorry to lose time in going, and should not choose to be later than the hour appointed," replied Mary. "I'll look to have a fitting horse, ma'am, and one that is used to the road, and that is what but few are. The road is no good one in parts, that's the truth, and I'm not over sure that there's another man besides myself that would like to undertake the job, but I've no objection to driving you myself, ladies, provided you think it worth your while to pay for a tradesman for the loss of his time. Of course, I can't charge my labours like a postboy." "If you take means, sir, to get us to the Deep Valley Mill by the hour appointed and drive us back again safely to this house, we shall not dispute about the price. But remember, if you please, that the carriage or cart, whatever it is, must have accommodations for the child I hope to bring away with me." "I will take care of that, ma'am. I will put a little stool on it in purpose, and I think if I say 2 guineas, ma'am, for the job, which is no easy one, but that you can't complain of the price." "I shall certainly not complain of it," said Miss Brotherton. 9 o'clock then was fixed at the hour of setting out, and Mr. Timothy Smith departed. Mrs. Prescott's roast chicken and French beans were treated very differently from her previous breakfast and luncheon. Mary Brotherton was in higher spirits than she had enjoyed for many weeks. She felt confident of success, and for the first time in her life, perhaps, fully enjoyed the possession of the wealth which gave her such powers of surmounting difficulties. The kind-hearted Mrs. Tremlett was at length as sanguine and almost as happy as herself, and very freely confessed, again and again, that her dear young lady knew 10 times better how to manage things than she did, old as she was. The evening was again spent in a long, late ramble, and though they did not forget that over a certain towering height, pointed out by Miss Prescott, lay the dismal spot called the Deep Valley, the exceeding happiness which was anticipated for one who dwelt there made them almost forget the misery of the rest.